So Dinesh Shah is the Director of FinTech Research at the Bank of Canada. We're excited to have him as a keynote speaker. I've known him for several years, and he's been around the academic circuit as well as working on the policy side with the bank. He's been doing digital cash and digital payment methods for many, many years. Probably the most notable project was Project Jasper and the different iterations of it that looked at large value payments based on blockchain technology. He also has some industry experience in startups and in the financial industry, and he has a bachelor's in physics. So with no further ado, I'll turn it over to you, Dinesh. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Jeremy, for the introduction, and many thanks for the organizers for inviting me to speak here. It's very kind of you. This discussion here is going to be very broad, almost a sort of kind of where we are right now. So there won't be much depth in terms of particular areas we're working on, but perhaps if there's some time for questions at the end, I can take one or two of those. The first thing I'll say is, please note that these are my views and not necessarily those of my employer. Okay, so we'll proceed like this. I'll give you very shortly just a little bit about what's going on globally. I think most of you will be just as well informed as I am about what's happening there. A little bit on where we are with central bank digital currency here in Canada, of course, and really some. Probably most of my conversation around just a bit of a smorgasbord of the sort of problems we're working on, and to take the hard, as in quotes, they vary from very hard to maybe perhaps not so hard. So first of all, this global view. What's sort of going on. Actually, what I'll do first thing is, you see that at the top there, I've said a retail CBDC. I'll just make a quick distinction between how we think about retail and wholesale, because, if you were to take that away and just think about CBDC, at the kind of monetary level, they're the same thing, right? They're just, CBDC is just an electronic claim on a central bank, in this case, with the Canadian dollar as a unit of account. Really simple as that. After that, everything else is about the form factor and so on. Not trivial, but still that distinction between retail and wholesale really only comes about not at the kind of the way in which this money appears on our balance sheet and so on, but some of the kind of higher order things. So, for example, when we think about retail CBDC, we think of this as a immediate settlement, right? Whereas often when you're thinking about wholesale, there's a whole bunch of work that has to happen around liquidity efficiency. And efficient use of collateral. So you have things like netting functions that wouldn't appear in the retail world. So that's really the only distinction. So most of my remarks here will be about the retail side of things, but I'll just touch on wholesale. So you've seen, I'm sure, that there are a few countries who have actually gone live with a central bank digital currency. I think Bahamas was first out of the gate to do it officially. And I'm not actually making much of a distinction between live and major pilots, because some of these major pilots are really big, right? So China, of course, just by virtue of the population is, as you can imagine, covers, I think, 10 cities, maybe more now. Probably mixed results, but still, it's a very large pilot. Eastern Caribbean Central Bank released Dcash on a few of the nations in that monetary union, and I think Jamaica has a major pilot and has committed publicly to actually launching a CBDC. I think next year, if I remember correctly, and Nigeria has a very large scale pilot also. So for these early adopters, there's a bit of a, there's one common theme, apart from perhaps China, which is that a lot of the driver is financial inclusion. And of course, I think that's one of the reasons, not the only one, why they've actually moved very, very quickly to this, because they had a very, very clear policy driver. I think in many other countries, especially in countries like Canada, and I would just to generalize, I'd say many other liberal democracies, the process of getting to the decision on whether to issue a CBDC or not is much more involved. You know, there's much more consultation with stakeholders across society, and there's a path to navigate that takes some time. So it's frankly easier to ask these days, you know, who's not actually working, which central banks are not working on CBDC, and there's probably very few. Lots of serious research going on, you know, really across the board. I think the latest figure is probably something like 90% of central banks are considering this, and this group of 7 central banks, which is I think if I rattle off quickly, Bank of Canada, the Federal Reserve, Bank of England, ECB, Swiss National Bank, Bank of Japan, Swedish Riksbank, maybe missing one, and the BIS have been working on, not really jointly developing anything, but really sharing a lot of information across the board, right? Thinking about, you know, thoughts on policy, economic consequences, as well as the types of solutions. And that's kind of in its infancy, somewhat informal, but it's just an example of international cooperation that benefits really everyone. So it's what's happening kind of on the retail side. On the wholesale side, it seems that almost exclusively the various bits of research going on are centered around blockchain, and it doesn't entirely surprise me, because in some ways you can think of this as there's a bigger picture here, a bigger question here of not just of CBDC, but really an upgrade to the financial system, and whether blockchain/DLT provides a unique value proposition that allows us to you know, advance the efficiencies and innovations in financial market infrastructure. It seems to me that I mean, there's lots of, you know, ideas around this, of course, but it seems to me the principal idea when we think about wholesale CBDC is this idea of you know, across 2 central banks that you can update multiple ledgers reliably without needing trusted intermediaries. And I think that's kind of the key thing when we think about a particular jurisdiction. I think the question of whether DLT adds value, I think is much more difficult, because of this fundamental property of blockchains in the way in which trust is engineered. And I would argue that doesn't apply so much within countries, but of course that point can be debated. And well, yeah, I mean, that third point there around asset tokenization, you see, of course, a lot of this happening on the, you know, the CBDC by itself isn't that useful. You've got to think about the asset side, and of course, lots of work going on around the world with commercial institutions making efforts to tokenize assets onto blockchain. And that leads central banks with, I think, with this question, you know, if it is the case that the you know, financial market infrastructures are actually tokenizing assets, which they seem to be, do we actually need CBDC to also be tokenized and serve the DVP function in those financial markets? I think that's a bit of an open question. So although central banks started with doing some of the experimental work, including ourselves, you know, back in 2016, in many ways ahead of the asset tokenization efforts recently. Of course, it you know, it has to live within a context, and that context is evolving. So we will see what happens over the next few years around this. And one thought I've often had is, you know, perhaps of taking a skeptical view, which is, you know, that there's many ways of upgrading financial market infrastructures, and to me, it's not always clear that you know, DLT is actually a really good fit. But I think others might argue that it doesn't kind of matter, right? You know, in that, you know, there's momentum behind it, and there's something of a wave, and you could just see it as something of a useful forcing function, right, to upgrade financial market infrastructure. That doesn't necessarily mean we'll end up in the most effective and efficient place we should, but anyway, it's just an interesting thought. And of course, you'll probably be aware that there are lots of projects that have very interesting projects that our peers have undertaken over the last few years, and they publicly reported on these. Okay, so just turning to our own story here in Canada. some of this background, I think many people will know, but one or two things might surprise you. We've actually been at this for quite a long time. In fact, before I joined as the sort of first technologist on the CBDC work at the bank, and it really dates back about 10 years, starting not so much, this might surprise some people, right, as a reaction to what was happening with cryptocurrencies. And of course, 10 years ago, this was really around, Bitcoin and other early cryptos. That wasn't actually the principal driver. It was really thinking about banknotes, right? The future of banknotes, thinking about the potential for a decrease in the use and therefore the utility of banknotes in the economy, and whether there needs to be an electronic version of a banknote to preserve the utility of public money in the economy. That's really where it started, but of course we've gone a long way since then. Lots of work going on across the board, policy development, economic consequences, and technology. And I think all of these things really need to happen together rather than a sort of a waterfall of thinking about the policy by itself and then economic consequences and then the technology, because of course each of these informs the other. Back in 2020, we put out a policy position, which you can still see. That was very broad, but it had the basic pieces. But of course, there's a lot more consideration required to arrive at a final policy position. And I should remind everyone that there's no decision to issue a central bank digital currency, and that's something that the government as a whole would have to decide on. I mentioned the work with our peers in the previous slide, and this point about wholesale being treated somewhat distinctly, even though as a money, you could argue it's really the same thing. And CBDC also isn't being undertaken in isolation, right? There are you will probably know that there's large modernization program going on. A couple of pieces of that are already in place on the wholesale side, and I think over the next 2 years, I'm not quite sure, there's going to be a retail side, a major upgrade with the real-time rails. On the banknote side, we're looking at building new efficiencies to make sure that that cash is available as long as possible. And we have a policy position which is, as long as Canadians want notes, the Bank of Canada will produce them. And then finally, as a contingency, we're building this capability to issue a CBDC if the government decides that's what we should do. We don't actually have conditions under which we'll issue. And not only do we not have conditions, we don't have some kind of metric. So for example, there's the metric that says if the use of banknotes falls below level X, that's a trigger for the Bank of Canada to issue a digital currency. You can imagine that the decision is much more nuanced than that. So we can't just give a kind of, a very simple metric like that. But there are these two scenarios which stand out, which are very, very intuitive and easy to understand how we might react. So first, I've already mentioned that banknotes usage falls to a point where there's a bit of a collapse in the network effect of banks, and they really don't become useful anymore. And that, I think, creates a problem for many, many people in society. And the other one is of a non-Canadian dollar money making major inroads into the Canadian economy. And if it reaches a substantial point, that of course gives us a problem with conducting monetary policy and financial system stability policy. So that could be another scenario under which it will be seriously considered. And there may be others. These are not the only two scenarios. I think many of you will be aware of these set of features / policy goals around CBDC, but just to quickly list them, this idea, just like banknotes, of universal accessibility. To the extent possible, anyone and everyone should have the ability to use CBDC regardless of their circumstances. We think of very high levels of privacy, but I should also add, this is in relation to compliance. The compliance, gives some kind of floor. A floor to what's possible on the privacy side, but nevertheless, without having arrived exactly at what that privacy position is, we think that of privacy as a public good, and it's something that Canadians really do value. We expect this to be very resilient. It becomes part of you can argue part of a national resilience infrastructure, in the same way we think about needing to keep the power and communication networks going. You can also argue that money should also fall in that bucket of really essential services that we need. Of course, it has to be safe, so that Canadians are confident that there's a bigger picture there, of course, by the value of money, inflation and so on. But here, what I mean is something narrower, right? Which is that they can rely on it always being CBDC always being available when they need to use it. And if it's possible, this could also provide a competition in the payments market, and possibly drive down prices and improve choices for Canadians. And finally, the monetary sovereignty point is really about ensuring that we're able to conduct monetary policy by really preserving the Canadian dollar as the unit of choice in Canada. So how do we get there? I think it's a very complex journey, actually, and I think I indicated earlier that that there's unlike, say, a commercial firm that just sees some opportunity in the market and jumps to it. I mean, that's often complex enough. When we think about policy development, there's a lot of consideration of many stakeholders in society, and that really makes it quite complex and quite different from maybe commercial products. But nevertheless, this is how we think about it, and there's a kind of a vertical time arrow here with so we proceed with this idea of quite a naive approach, right? We just take some idealized policy aims, which we haven't really checked in with other stakeholders in society. Similarly, we have technology that we haven't really tested, but we think could be used here, and some kind of business model, which again we haven't really checked with other players in the ecosystem, and we arrive at some kind of design that's conceivable, but we know it's somewhat naive, but it gives us a starting point. And then we move to what I'm calling a feasible stage here, where we start kind of testing these things, start kicking the tires on the technology. The policy formulation has moved along somewhat, and we start getting some sense of taking that conceivable design, putting it on the table, see how this, how potential ecosystem actors react to it. And then hopefully we'll end up in some kind of place where, okay, we don't completely know if these designs, both the business design and the technical design, will really work. But we have more confidence, right, that they're feasible, and perhaps a part of that could be costing and so on. And then there's a stage where we really do need to understand, right, if this is actually viable in the marketplace, right, that it really will work. And of course, it becomes much more extensive. The consultation becomes more extensive. Perhaps there are field trials of various sorts. We've really understood the technology well and the marketplace well, and we get to hopefully a viable design. Of course, I think many of you have been at the sharp end of product development, and you know that no matter what you do, when you come to market, you might get a surprise, right? So of course, there's additional steps after this, right, to make sure that you can be agile and react quickly to what you actually find in the marketplace. But that's roughly how I think we expect to proceed. Okay, so yeah, as I say, to take this with a slight pinch of salt, because although these are hard problems, they're not wicked problems, right? I think they're all solvable. We're not dealing with a climate emergency here, right? So I think this is quite solvable. So just to kind of step through some examples, and of course there are more. Oh, sorry. Before I go through some examples, I'll just talk about, I showed you earlier some features and policy goals, but just broadly say, what are some of the difficulties in achieving these? So take in the case of universal access, well, we're talking about a number of dimensions here, right? We're talking about perhaps people who can't afford or choose not to have a smartphone, for example, who have accessibility challenges, who live in areas where they don't have reliable telephony, cellular telephony, for example. So there's a whole set of challenges there. privacy and compliance. If we're aiming for very high levels of privacy, well, how do we create that while at the same time having an obligation to compliance in its various forms, AML, CTF, and so on. Similarly, the resilience. How can we go much further than current payment systems? So, for example, with network communications networks and power being unavailable, possibly for extended periods of time. Security, I think, is probably fair to say, although it's hard to measure, that a CBDC could be a more lucrative target for certain kinds of actors than could a commercial system. So correspondingly, we would imagine that the demands on security may be correspondingly higher. And finally, when we have a model which is public and private, how do we ensure in the separation of responsibilities that the system as a whole remains integral and secure? Just to give a little flavor of these things. So, I mean, how are we thinking about solving, for these channels? I mean, there's a number of approaches we're taking here. So there is hands-on work in a couple of areas. So just a distinction between proofs of concept and proofs of technology. When we think about a concept, we think more or less about a system, a CBDC system, really from end to end. And we did a little bit of that actually a few years ago now. And I think one of the things we learned there was we really need to drill down a little bit more. In other words, even though the policy formulation is not completely clear, it was, I think, fairly clear that it's unlikely we would just take a solution off the shelf and be able to run with it, right? That the fit isn't quite there. So what we did then is changed tack somewhat and started thinking about those specific areas like universal access, privacy, security, resilience, and so on, and really drilling down into these individually. So, for example, and then what we ended up was doing these some desk work, but of course some proofs of technology as well to really exercise particular ideas. Model X. So we're just sourcing new ideas. This one I'm quite proud of, and many thanks to many of the audience actually, and certainly the program committee members were involved in this. So this was the idea here was to solicit from universities ideas with as little influence as possible from the central bank, right? It's an exercise in trying to find new ideas. Of course, there's lots of expertise out there, which we try to tap both in academia and in the private sector. We're also doing some leading edge work. This idea of puff cash, physically unclonable, utilizing physically unclonable functions as a security mechanism, as a uniqueness mechanism. And as we publish a lot of this, you'll see most of our publications are on the policy and economic side, but you'll start seeing more and more over the next year or so on the technical solutions side. Okay, so let's just take a few examples actually. So let's do a time check. For some people, in a steady state, they don't have reliable network connectivity, and part of the work actually is try and measure how big a problem that is. Of course, it's a moving target as we have better and better connectivity, but it's not perfect, and even now, there's actually quite a proportion of Canadians who don't have cellular phones, for example, let alone reliable connectivity. And there will be times in extremis, as we saw recently here in Ottawa with this, I don't know what it was, actually kind of a tornado-ish storm that took out power, in Ottawa in quite a few places. So I was out for 24 hours, and I think many people were out for more than a week. So there will be these extended outages. Something that, of course, the private sector does think about, but when we have a product or a service provided by government, I think there's an extra onus on thinking about events that perhaps may only happen, let's say, once every 5 to 10 years, but are important societally, and therefore government needs to grapple with. So the question becomes, can we, as a solution to this problem, how far can we go with an offline CBDC capability, meaning a transfer peer-to-peer without a wider network of some kind? And it seems to us that's less than a trivial problem. It's also not new. I mean, back in the 1990s, Mondex and actually a few other experiments around the world have grappled with this and did have a solution. The problem, of course, here is one of security, right? Just how you can do it, but just how secure is it? How do we understand the risks? Not only what are the risks, but how do we even understand them? How do we measure them, and how do we convey them to policymakers? I think that itself is difficult, and of course these change over time as technology, as adversaries improve their sophistication. And if we can't do a kind of a perfect example where you can have multiple hops or endless hops, right, where you have some kind of perfect container, some kind of perfect secure transfer mechanism where you can just transfer, just like banknotes, for one person to another. If you have to scale that back, okay, how do you do that so that one hop offline, and just how useful is that as a solution? So I think we would have to work out. So some of the things we're thinking about here, I mentioned, I think already, that there's thinking of tamper-resistant devices as a mechanism to ensure that there's a safe way to store value and credentials, for example, and using these devices to avoid exfiltration of information. So of course, the one way to do this is to actually stand up some kind of example system and organize a red team and a blue team, so that there's an attacker and a defender, and see how far we can go with this. This of course is not new. You see lots of systems, of course, any credit card, but in terms of storage of value storage, many systems around the world on mass transit make use of this. But of course, the threats there are not the same, because you typically can only use these on the transit system, and this is not a generally usable money. If it is a generally usable money, the incentive to actually attack any of these tamper-resistant devices is that much higher. And assuming you can't create this perfect a system that's completely tamper-proof, let alone tamper-resistant, maybe there are other mitigating things you can do, like reducing holding and transfer limits. That's a very practical proposition. I think some economists definitely worry about, why there should be limits and so on. And if there are, does it reduce the utility of a CBDC, and does it give you problems with the singleness of money and so on? So this is very much, the idea of practicality. So there's ideas of holding transfer limits, time limits. I think there's a paper published by one of my former economics colleagues, Martin Van Doort, which is you'll find on our website, around the idea of expiring CBDC on these devices. And then there's a question of refresh cycles, just as we do with our credit cards, of course, every whatever it is, 3-4 years, principally because the technology becomes a little dated as sophistication of adversaries increases, and you have to keep recycling. So the question becomes just how frequently do you recycle? And there's this idea of a local trust zone. So if you're in an area where there isn't networks available, nevertheless, instead of just the two parties involved in the transaction, by having a third party or even more, you create this idea of a local trust zone where you can validate the integrity of the devices that the payer and the payee, I guess the payer in this case, is using with this local third party. So that adds a little bit more complication, but still avoids some of the risks inherent in a purely P2P transaction. I mentioned accessibility. So this is something we're paying a lot of attention to. There's I wish I could quote the numbers. I should have researched these, but the as we live longer, it seems like cognitive impairment is really, I think, a much underappreciated problem in society, as as we have a growing demographic that's older adults. Something I think we need to contend with. And of course, even with the more well-known, so for example, sight impairment, other types of accessibility problems we see, we can start to really leverage digital technology, I think, far more than we do right now to really provide solutions, right, for accessibility. So some of the things we're thinking about is this idea, again, actually not very new. It seems like, whenever you think there's something new, do a little bit of research and you find it's not such a new idea. But this idea of deviceless payments, so someone with, well, it could be anyone, but of course we're thinking principally about people with accessibility issues. So for example, if they don't have good motor control, where they can pay at a merchant without really having any kind of device, right? So of course it requires some kind of biometric authentication, and there's all sorts of questions around that, with privacy and so on. And I guess especially when it's something that's provided by the state, is that would create issues. So of course we need to be very transparent about any such solutions and how they work and so on. So some exploration going on there with voice payments. So again, without the need for any kind of dexterity and so this possibility, and this course is growing. We all, not all, but I certainly don't have a voice assistant in the voice-based assistant, personal assistant in a home. But of course, we're getting more and more familiar. These are becoming more ubiquitous. That seems like a logical place to investigate. And the last one is actually quite interesting. This is something of a new one for us. This idea of collaborative payments, and the observation here is that, and many of you, I think, especially if you have kids, or older kids, have probably seen this, where sometimes you end up, for example, giving your credit card, right, to one of your kids because they don't have access and so on. Or more importantly, you might find people with cognitive impairments, older adults, seeking the help of someone else in making a payment. So what I find interesting about this is that, as well as thinking about money as a monetary system, as a technical system, it's also a social system in many ways. And by thinking about it that way, we can try to incorporate some of these interactions that people make, where they bring in a third party to really help them with the transaction, whether it's giving them a thumbs up if they're going to spend, say, more than $50 on something. So another piece of work we'll be undertaking quite soon. Privacy and compliance is a big one. And of course, we never just say privacy, right? It's always related to compliance. This idea of, I'm using the term here, maximizing privacy. I just want to be careful with saying that, right? Because this is not a established policy goal that, we will make this maximally private, or that, this is suggesting that the bank is considering anonymous transactions. Not the case. The policy work is still outstanding, and it's of course bigger than the Bank of Canada, right? We have privacy laws which are evolving in themselves. You see this most clearly in the European Union, and they will evolve here in Canada, which creates complications. And there are many groups in society who have an interest in privacy, of course. So I'm not here saying that we've established a policy position. However, for our technical research, we're just making this assumption, right? Which is that we say that compliance is a given, the current laws are just a given. But within that context, how far can we go in maximizing privacy? And that seems to be just a useful assumption, right, for us to undertake our privacy work. Okay, so I mean, it's a little bit trite to almost say it, right? But of course, we want to consider privacy right at the outset and throughout really all our system design considerations, right? So this is really baked in right from the ground level, and it's not just some afterthought. And of course, technology is not the only way of doing this, and it can't be. There are there's some very important operational design, even inter-institutional design needs here, as well as, of course, being true to the letter of the law, and perhaps going even further. That said, we are interested actually in these privacy enhancing techniques that I think many in the audience are actually working with. And we've done some work on this. It's still ongoing. We don't have a definitive conclusion, but so far at this point in time, it does feel to us like all these techniques are not really ready for prime time. And I think there are kind of two broad reasons for that. The most obvious one is just computational demand, right? They typically can be extremely demanding. So, for example, in the case of the zero-knowledge proof work, I think to generate a proof on even a high-end smartphone, like I can't remember what it was, maybe an iPhone 9, or if there's such a thing. Anyway, a pretty high-end smartphone. It took something like 10 seconds, I believe, right, to generate a proof. And of course, from a user experience point of view, that doesn't work, let alone this being practically impossible to do on a entry-level phone, which I think we would have to provide. So that's one area. So there's computational demand. And I think the other one, which definitely more loosely, is really around the complexity of implementation. These schemes are sometimes very sophisticated, and I do have a concern that around reliability. I mean, there's a relationship, of course, between the complexity of a system and its brittleness. We haven't thought about that analytically. It was just a kind of intuitive thought. But I think that is one problem. Nevertheless, we're staying abreast of developments here and continuing our thinking on this. And frankly, it's going to be years until if a CBDC is introduced. So the world may have changed by then. These techniques will improve, and Moore's law and Metcalfe's law continues to be at work here. Okay, I see I'm a little bit slow here. Jeremy, how am I for time?
If you want to wrap up in maybe about 10 minutes, I would leave lots of time for questions, but you can take a little longer too.
Okay, that'll work. So I think, privacy and compliance. Of course, this is actually, it goes back to my point about timeline. I mean, I would imagine at the minimum, and we actually don't have there's no timeline, right, for introduction of a CBDC and so on. It depends on so many things, let alone if we'd even do it. But we are talking years away. So although at one level, it seems silly to be thinking about the possibility of quantum-based attacks, I think it does make sense to first start thinking about this now, and we have been doing that. So there's work going on in thinking about just how do you not only how do you make sure that any system we might design is guards against quantum-based attacks, but also if we were to use some of these techniques now, for example, the privacy enhancing techniques, and if we start using post-quantum crypto on those, just how much worse does it get as far as computational demand is concerned? And does that then mean that those techniques really are not just 5 years away, but much further away? And the other question is around the roadmap. If we start with a system based on classical crypto and we need to move to post-quantum crypto, how do we do that? Well, what is the strategy in doing that? What's the timing? And how do we do that in a way that is not disruptive? What happens to information that was secured, encrypted under classical methods? And does that information, is it still sensitive? And if it is, how do we ensure that in a post-quantum world it remains secure? So some obvious thoughts around this. So one of them, of course, is to just take these, I guess, soon to be standardized crypto constructs and just test them in a lab environment to see what their performance is and so on. Maybe a bit more elaborate is to actually take some kind of operational system that that is not decided. Of course, we haven't finished with the design yet, but seems representative of a system that we could imagine would be representative of a CBDC system, and try and migrate it to post-quantum crypto and measure, right? See what the impact is. Understand, in doing so, I think we would probably learn a lot about the types of strategies we should employ in moving to that world. And lastly, measure, if we are truly interested in some techniques like privacy enhancing techniques, which we could advance those to post-quantum crypto and measure the impacts of those. So moving closer to actually the blockchain world, and I barely touched on blockchain in this conference, in this talk. So this is on our minds, programmability, right? And whether a CBDC system should incorporate some possibility of extensibility through smart contracts, some programmable means, and so on. Don't really understand what the utility is actually at this point, but we can imagine that there are some possible use cases in the future. A couple of problems, of course, as many of you will know, worked in this space, there are vulnerabilities and we should see those in a quite spectacular way in a couple of examples. So just how do we make sure that this can be kept safe? Both in terms of the smart contracts themselves, and also some vulnerabilities with utilizing information from external oracles. So again, this one option is to just try and even think what are these use cases. Although I understand by definition you don't really know, right? This is about the future. An important question I think is if we did this, what would the central bank, what the risks the central bank would be taking by providing this on the platform? And does it really need to, or is it something that the private sector could do, building on top of CBDC? So it's almost like a platform on a platform sort of idea, where the central bank doesn't directly provide this, an open question. So we're going on around thinking of potential verification tools of smart contracts to understand their safety, and finally some work around if there is this problem of using oracles, are there ways in which we can provide security guarantees to ensure that some of those vulnerabilities are not realized? And finally, I'll talk a little bit about blockchain. I think many of you may have seen some of my views. I think there's probably something on YouTube about this, especially in the retail context. I think there's a difference between the application of blockchain in the retail world. I think in the wholesale world, I do think they're different. But there's still this question of, is DOT necessary and is it sufficient for a retail CBDC? And of course, we have to think about that, in the world in 5 years and the world in 10 years or so. So this is still a bit of an open question. But that question about, is it necessary? Like, as I say, many of you will know my view around this, that it really isn't clear. I mean, to me, there seems to be a mismatch between the sort of fundamental organizing principle of blockchain and its value proposition, meaning that this property of generating trust in a crowd, with the reality of for CBDC. I'm not talking about crypto here, of course, for CBDC, where we have this institutional organization and institutional trust, I would say, and it seems to me to not fit. And I find it quite hard to see now that there are secondary properties. So people often talk about resilience, for example, with that I can see some value. But the big one, this idea of the trust mechanism, seems to me not to fit. But nevertheless, so that's around necessity. And of course, is it sufficient? I mean, one immediate challenge, which seems to me still outstanding, is the problem of throughput, transaction throughput, whether it'll just be fast enough in a world where we might be talking about microtransactions, imagining of a world not quite realized yet of IoT and smart cities and so on. So as I say, we've got to think about this, not just the world as it is, but as it will be in 10 years or so. Okay, thank you so much, Jeremy. I don't know.
All right, thank you very much. People won't unmute, but we can virtually clap. It was a very good presentation, a good overview of the different issues. If you have questions, please drop them in the chat. There's a couple of comments and questions, so I'll start with those, and I'll wait on other questions. Otherwise, I could ask Dinesh questions for the next hour. But anyways, okay, so the first question I'm going to actually split into two. So I'll ask them to you one by one. So Michael Lee asks, what do you think about CBDC's interoperability? So would a Canadian CBDC strive to interoperate with other countries' CBDCs?
Yeah, that's it's a very good question, actually. So, I mean, the first thing I'll say, right, is that our motivation, our driver here is really the domestic case, right? It's very much about, and of course, and there's a interoperability question, not between CBDCs, but even the question of CBDCs interoperating with other rails in the Canadian market, right? So it's integration with in the future with RTR, for example, or the real-time rails that's coming about, right? So the ease with which you can transfer money from a central bank liability to a commercial bank liability and vice versa, for example, right? But of course, the question is aimed at between countries. There's a couple of thoughts about that. As I say, that's not first and foremost in people's mind, and I think for most countries that's true. But there's two answers for that. So one is that yes, we could think about common protocols, even if we don't need the common stacks. We could think about common protocols and make sure that we adhere to those. Of course, standards take a long time in creating, but given the timelines, I think that is conceivable. So that we made different stacks, but having the same protocol could be really important. And you can imagine this could really, ease a lot of issues, just the cost, right, and the pain of making international transfers. But there's another route here as well, which is, and I think there's far more work going on this, as I showed in one of the early slides, is that on the wholesale side, there is much more work going on around cross-border. So, for example, the MCBDC project bridge is considering movement of money between, I think that one's UAE, China, Thailand, and maybe one other country, and that's part of that. So you could imagine that the channel isn't direct from retail to retail system, but flows through a more of a wholesale CBDC system. So there's that work going on in the background, and I should say that central banks are thinking about this not necessarily directly in the retail CBDC space, but more generally as part of the some G20 work. I think one of the building blocks of Block 19 or whatever of a G20 initiative to improve cross-border transfers.
Great. And a follow-up question. Okay, what's the concern around a CBDC being able to sort of remotely deactivate? So let's say that someone's holding a Canadian CBDC as foreign reserves, another country. How do you, is there a technical reason to want to be able to remotely deactivate it, or on the opposite side, should it be asserted that is not possible at all? And then similarly, I guess if Canada were to hold a CBDC of another country, it would want assurances that it can be remotely deactivated.
Such an interesting question. So I guess I'll have to guess at what the motivation for the question is, but I think of a couple of immediate things. I mean, on the one hand, of course, it's problematic because on a whim, if you deactivate someone's holdings and therefore the ability to use them, of course, you can argue that, I mean, this is so different from physical banknotes, for example, right? That if some malicious actor, I guess government, right, were to do that, then there's obviously credibility problem with that. But on the other hand, you can imagine for perhaps something like compliance with anti-money laundering sanctions, for example, that could be a useful tool. But of course, there'd have to be some pretty significant safeguards in place before being able to do such a thing, right? That ensures it couldn't be done on some kind of a political whim, I guess. That's very much my own personal view. I mean, there's certainly no kind of policy position on this, right? And again, it's much broader than a Bank of Canada view. This probably involves all sorts of other thinking outside the bank's remit. It's an interesting question there.
Okay, another question, a hypothetical that ties into something you mentioned. So let's say that the use of banknotes in Canada dwindles to the point that merchants actually stop accepting them. So you can't use them universally. Then what do you do as a central bank? Do you try and prop up the system, or do you let two economies emerge, ones for cash and ones who want to use some for some form of bank payment?
Yeah, I mean, this is the world that I think Scandinavia finds itself in, right? If you go to Sweden, right, you find that many merchants actually won't accept cash, and in fact, many banks at the counter won't deal with cash. You have to either give notice or use the ATM, right? So it's actually, the world is uneven, right? And so we don't have that problem here in Canada, but that does exist in other parts of the world. So and again, this is a bit of a my own view, but I think that this idea of, and it's nicely put there, right? Do we have a world where we have a cash economy and we have a digital economy? To me, seems like a tragedy, actually. And just societally, it just, you can imagine all sorts of kind of really undesirable effects of that. So the first thing, as I said, the idea is to try and ensure that cash is not only available, but the point being made that it's also accepted. In Canada, I think there are countries where there are laws where merchants have to accept legal tender, right? It's legal tender, and they have to accept it. Not the case in Canada. I don't think it's being considered here. It's always a bit of a problem in an open society, right? To enforce laws like that. But I think there are probably other ways in which we can improve matters, like trying to reduce the costs of cash and its distribution and so on, in some ways, to try and keep that going. Failing that, of course, the idea is that as per scenario one, CBDC would fit that bill, right? It would be accessible to anyone and everyone, and of course it should be attractive to merchants, or at least really add no additional burden for merchants, right, to take on alongside credit cards and debit cards.
So that question from Jeff Goodall, and he adds a little quote: "I'll leave my cash on the counter and you'll decide whether you want to call the police." So, okay, another question, I guess, for me is, you yourself, you've worked on digital payments for many years, and people at Bank of Canada have worked presumably even longer, even before Bitcoin emerged. And so I'm wondering, I'm interested in your sort of long perspective. So you've seen things like Mint Chip, fail. Going back even further, things like maybe Mondex or other systems, you've seen some success with cryptocurrencies. And so what are the kind of lessons that you can take from all those older systems? Is it just a case that you can basically ignore them, or are there things to be learned when designing CBDC from sort of the past history?
Oh no! I mean, it's definitely a mistake to ignore them, but it's also, I think, a mistake to have a kind of knee-jerk reaction, right? Which is that, oh well, that thing didn't work, and therefore this won't, right? So, as an example, if we were to look at a Mondex, and I, really wish I understood that better. Or, there are a few people around who worked at Mondex. I think one of the things you can probably think about is not so much the technology and even the user experience and so on, but the way in which the pilot and the experimentation was undertaken, right? That there are sometimes it's very hard, right, to get information from the marketplace and to take those signals, reinvent the product or just the product, and then go to the market in a different way, right? So I think you really have to understand not only what happened on the technology side, but what happened in actually pushing those products out, right? Sometimes those things can be flawed. So there's a whole piece around the strategy, and that goes out there. The other one, I think that's important, and we don't again, don't have a clear policy position on this, right? I think there's still this outstanding question of, well, just how, if we were to launch a CBDC, just how much adoption does it need to have, right? Because on the one hand, some people might say, well, it needs to be really quite significant, even in a steady state, to have value, because it's only then that the competitive forces come about and so on. But the others might say, well, no, not necessarily, right? It's more around either being always there for conditions that are not normal, for example. That's when it really becomes very, very useful. Whether it's in certain economic times, or whether there's outages and so on, right? So it becomes kind of a backup, and then of course then the onus is on trying to ensure that the costs of the product are in proportion, right, to its adoption. So I think that I think that question is still needs a lot of consideration, but it's a good one. I don't know if I really answered your question well then, Jeremy.
No, I mean, it's, I was just curious about your insights and sort of how you approach the topic. Obviously, you don't have to have all the answers about what went wrong with all those old schemes. Okay, I'm going to ask one final as a transition question, meaning I'm going to start setting up the next speaker while you answer it. So this is from Jordan Atkins, who asks, so we've seen some CBDC pilots. You mentioned them in your slides. Is there any lessons that we can learn, or is it too early to really start drawing lessons from those?
I mean, I'm sure we could some. I mean, many of those are are pilots, and they're in jurisdictions which are really quite different from Canada. But I think overall it probably is a little bit early. We're just waiting for one of the let's say more similar countries, right, to go ahead and put something out there.
Okay, fair enough. So thank you very, very much. And you might stick around and answer questions in the chat, maybe if there's some further questions. So thank you.